speaking of the modern US left, I was just about to ask you a second question of our video about Antifa in America today. So, what is Antifa in the US today? Are they real Marxists as they claim to be? They say they are real Marxists, and like you did an article, and I enjoyed your article. That proving, I recommend to read the article. I shared it on my YouTube community. Basically, in that article, you're saying that they are not they are not actual Marxists.
Right.
They are not actual Marxists from a real Marxian point of view.
Right.
And for those who are trying to say that's not a no true Scotsman. It's just the Antifa in America, they do not fit into the definition, don't they?
Right. Yes. So that's it. Words have meanings.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and if words don't have meanings, then what are we taught? We're just babbling, right? So, words have a meaning because of the definition that is contrasted to something else. Okay. Contrasted to something else. Is it? Like just on TV, you have definition. Like on old TVs, there was like two knobs. There was like definition and contrast. Okay. Your eye has like rods and cones. Okay. Definition and contrast. Words have meanings. So it's convenient for conservatives to call BLM
and Antifa
Marxists
and commies and
commies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help things. In fact, it reinforces the point that they walk around with like hammer and sickle logos on their helmets and stuff like that, and that the fake leaders of BLM who social media and academia conspired to declare had invented BLM, who happened to be three women, African-American women, say, oh, we are trained Marxists. We're trained Marxists. Well, I believe that people can be trained in Marxism and not be what Marx would say. It's a complicated. I want to make it like for people to like wrap their heads around really simply. Things are not what they call themselves. Like the Holy Roman Empire called itself that, right? But it wasn't actually. It was separate from papal authority, so it's not holy. It was German, so not Roman, and it was more of a federation of different principalities. You had the Junker nobility, and they had the smaller kings and stuff within this federation of the empire. So it wasn't like an empire like the emperor had absolute power. So it was neither holy, no Roman, no an empire. Or you can look at like the People's Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. Well, it's definitionally like a monarchy. And the definition of republic is like any other form of government that's not a monarchy. So I'm not going to argue that it's not a republic because they have a dictator. I'm going to say that it's a monarchy because it's the only people that have run the country have been the firstborn son or one of the sons of the guy who was in charge before. They're all related by blood. So it's a monarchy.
Yeah.
He's a king. But they call it a democratic republic. So we don't call, or you could call yourself God. Doesn't mean that you are. So Antifa, I'm not trying to beat this point to death because I'll get to the substance. But so BLM and Antifa are not communists just because they call themselves that. And
they are not Marxists.
It's convenient for their detractors, who I agree with their detractors about many things, by the way. I'm just saying they're not that because, but not only are they not, it doesn't matter what your ideas are in your head. You don't just say, I don't wear a t-shirt, I'm a good person, but you go around like robbing old ladies and shit. That's not, so you can, it doesn't matter what's on your t-shirt. Now, I'm not saying they're fascists because I don't like them or, whatever. I'm saying that they fit the historic definition
of fascists.
Of fascism, not in its earliest infancy when it was actually a peasants and local community movement that had more in common with the left at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But the era of fascism when business owners and the landed elites were financing a populist movement to put pressure, horizontal pressure on. So I don't know if you have the article on hand, but I give like 5 or 6, clear reasons. But basically, the most important thing is that like a left wing, like a communist or socialist movement, is only financed through organized labor. So you have a union like a syndicate, and the workers pay what are called union dues.
Yeah.
Now, through the union dues, they can finance their own political party and their own movement with that money. Like each worker pays $30 a month, right? And you have millions of workers, so that's big money. You can finance a political party that way. It would be called a labor party or a socialist party or a communist party, whatever. But that would be a legitimate communist party. You don't have to agree with them, but it would be labeled correctly that way. However, BLM Antifa are financed by George Soros and all these sort of billionaire philanthropists and
Michael
network
Bloomberg,
corporations, IBM, Microsoft. I mean, the list goes on. It's all in Democracy Alliance and other groups. There's one called Sunrise Revolution, Our Revolution. All of these are financed by PACs, super PACs, and pseudo PACs, which are anything but how organized labor historically financed their political movements, which in European history were called socialist and communist, syndicalist. So that's the thing. But dude, I mean, it's like people are so caught up in what are in Marxism. You have, when you're analyzing something, setting aside like the dialectical materialism, you have what's called base and you have what's called superstructure.
Yeah.
And the superstructure are like the laws and the ideology and the culture and things like that. And the base is like what is like the actual how it actually functions, like mechanically, or what is the material foundation of this thing. So you could, let's say you had like an anti-capitalist movement that was only financed through labor, through union dues from individual community members and workers, and had no financing from the wealthy or the elite at all.
Yeah.
Okay, they could call themselves the fascist party. They could wave giant, fascist flags. They could march around like in black paramilitary
black shorts,
uniform, in black shirts. But if they were only financed by organized labor, okay, and if their aim was anti-capitalist, they could call themselves fascists. All the liberals would call them fascists, but they would in fact be communists. In fact. Okay, that's how Marxism actually works. It's not what you call yourself, it's how you analyze it. And it's the material foundation and what class is supporting you and in whose class interests you are acting. That's the key. So that's Antifa is a fascist organization. BLM is a fascist organization. And now that doesn't mean that we have a fascist threat. Fascism was a different type of method of governing from 100 years ago, but we don't have a fascist threat. We have a much bigger threat today.
Yeah. And let me I don't know if you heard or not, but there is a Russian prominent political blogger, has a YouTube channel. It is almost 800,000 subscribers. It's called Polit Russia. His name is Ruslan Ostashko.
Yeah.
And do you know Ruslan Ostashko?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and he had a boxing match with a guy from Poland who fought in Donbass on the side of the Kiev regime. So, and he called that, and he said that my grandfathers who fought in the war against the Nazis, and this Polish asshole called our grandfathers quote unquote red fascists. And Ruslan Ostashko challenged this guy to a boxing match. So Ruslan won, and the Polish guy Tomasz, his name was Tomasz. He basically got the fuck out of Russia. So what my question is, do you think red fascism, red fascists is a real thing, or is it just some sort of anti-Russophobic, anti-communist term, red fascist?
Mm. So that is a fucking whopper, dude. Why would you ask that question? So look, because
Just
we're
out of
trying to,
interest.
well, look, we're trying to separate what people call themselves from what they are. Okay? So just because the Soviet Union called itself socialist, and just because the ruling party called itself communist, does not mean that it was a socialist state or that the ruling party was communist. It does mean that they weren't, but we just haven't established that yet. We haven't established that yet.
Yeah.
Just by calling themselves that doesn't mean that that's what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Marxist theory, what you have is something called the law of value, which is determinative of the part of how you define the base. So of the mode of production. So like in Marxist theory, you have this evolution of modes of production going back from ancient antiquity with sclavocratic states, and then you have feudalism, feudal societies, and then you have the bourgeois revolutions, develop capitalism, and then after that you have socialism, and then after that communism. So, but how you would know that you are not capitalist is because the law of value no longer exists. This is like a law like gravity. It's not like a law that you can arbitrate into. You can't like, oh, we've legislated against the law of no. It's like a law of gravity. It's an economic law. So the Soviet Union did not transcend the law of value. And so for that reason, many anarchists and Trotskyists, claim that, and then liberals who were close to these Trotskyists there was a group of American Trotskyists that made a very rightward shift and became super anti-Soviet and got liberal and conservative. The roots of neocons in America goes back to, people like this Crystal, Max Shachtman and stuff like that. So there's many interesting ideas that people should investigate if they're interested in the subject, if you want to get into that. Max Shachtman, the Workers' Party, the early days of the Socialist Workers' Party and things like that. But with regard to this point, with the thing is that Marx wrote, first of all, it doesn't matter, Marx would be totally wrong. But then how you define things, right? I mean, how do we define things? Because there's Marx of Marxism, of the followers who want to be communists and socialists, but then there's objective Marxism, which is a science, which is like a system of categorizing and understanding the world, that you don't have to be a communist to understand Marx and to use Marxist tools of analysis. It's called a toolbox. So to understand the world outside of just notions and ideas and feelings and shit, right? Like to understand rigorously and, what are the real schematics, what are the mechanics of what's moving this thing here. Marxism is invaluable. It's not the end all and be all. It's not the only tool, but if your toolbox doesn't involve that, you're missing a hammer, you're missing a screwdriver, you're missing a lot.
Yeah.
So the thing is that Marx wrote a book called The Critique of the Gotha Program. And in Critique of the Gotha Program, he's writing a polemic against another German socialist named Lassalle. And Lassalle was saying that, we're going to overcome capitalism and all the value that produced by the workers is going to go back to the workers. Right, all the value produced by will go back to the workers, And Marx said, no. Just because we've overthrown the capitalists doesn't mean that we've laid the material foundation for socialism. That doesn't mean that that we can start socialism. It just means that we've politically overthrown the ruling class. But it doesn't mean that we have the economic, technological foundation to overcome the law of value, which is rooted in scarcity. So in other words, if everyone needs a new pair of shoes every 6 months or 3 months or whatever, I mean, I think that I think market functions serve much better than determining how many pairs of shoes, from above. I mean, I think the market works much better. But just in Marxist theory, for example, assuming that everyone needs a new pair of shoes every 6 months, and you have 1 million people, right, then you have to produce like 2 million pairs of shoes a month. If you produce less than 2 million pairs of shoes a year. So if you produce or what did I say? 1 million people? Yeah, a month. You need every 6 months a new pair of shoes. 1 million people, 2 million. Yeah, 2 million pairs of shoes a year. So if you were producing less than 2 million pairs of shoes a year, then you would have a scarcity of shoes. So just because you've politically overthrown the ruling class, and you're, now you're being, you have some democratic or dictatorial, something in between, that's like the Workers' Party in power. It doesn't mean that, how do you determine who gets the shoes if there's not enough for everybody? So now so that's the law of value. That's scarcity. It's the law of value. So Marx is saying, no, you still have to develop the means of production in order to make this more gift type economy, future communist, future possible. So, but that doesn't mean that it's a capitalist society either, Yuri. That's the thing. So, the reason there's some legitimacy to the concept of red fascism, but it really begins to fall apart once you dig more deeply. There are many connections between Bolshevism and fascism that people don't, get into, but they approach the story all the wrong way. I would say that, the Soviet Union was not, look, I mean, it's, I don't want to get into a no true Scotsman fallacy issue thing. I mean, there wasn't any other society before it that could be called socialist. They called themselves socialist first, and they defined what that means. It is a little bit at odds with Marxist theory, but science is not conformed to theory. You have to change the theory to explain the real world. You don't deny reality because it doesn't conform to the theory. You see what I'm saying? So scientifically, Marxist theory would develop under Lenin to explain how actually socialism came to be. But I can understand the arguments that it wasn't socialist because the law of value existed. Yeah. On the other hand, when you read the Critique of the Gotha program, you can see that Marx understood that even though you could be building socialism and have overthrown the ruling class, you might still have money, you might still have scarcity, you might have differences in wages and stuff like that between people. I'm not saying that any kind of Marxist utopia is possible. I'm just educating your viewers about what the theory said and why people might say red fascism. So, but fascism was like a public relations, late fascism, pre-war fascism, but late fascism. Was like a public relations campaign that was agreed to by oligarchs who understood what happened is that historically in Europe, Germany had been the center of economic life and philosophical life, and had been catching up to England, and by 1899 GDP of Germany surpassed England minus its empire, minus the empire, but England alone. So World War I was already known, 20 years before that it was going to happen, and that Germany and England would be on opposite sides. Okay. In E.H. Carr's work on the foundations of international relations, the origins of international relations, he explains that even going back to the 17th century, the entire English system of dominance of Europe was based upon pitting France against Germany,
or Russia against Germany,
or supporting Germany against France until one got too strong, then support the other, or cause a war. So this is like a very sordid and long, bloody history of English interference in continental matters.
Europe,
back 4 or 5 centuries. Okay, so what happens with the Soviet Union is that economists understood that the weakness of Germany and the weakness of Italy is that the wealthy families were too divided, and even though there's a level of competition which produces like dynamism in an economy, there's levels of competition that you can't even get going. It's like a non-starter, because like this guy's wife is married to this guy's, second cousin, and then you can't work against this combine, but the mayor of this town is bought off. So you can't get the approval, the license to start the factory, because this family doesn't like that you snub them at the, at the waltz. Like these little family rivalries, these internecine rivalries between these ruling nobility families that owned factories in Germany was getting in the way of Germany consolidating a single state. I mean, Germany wasn't a single state until the very last 2 decades of the 19th century. They were centuries behind France. You know, Louis the 14th, you know, made France into like a nation state. Centuries before Germany. Centuries before, 200 years before, 240 years before Germany.
Yeah.
So Germany had economic dynamism, but it was the reality of laissez-faire is actually like can get in the way of development. Italy had similar problems, so we can just group the two together. Germany is considered Northern European, but by the close of the 19th century, it had a situation called combined and uneven development. Okay, so even though the political foundations of 19th century Germany were retarded, I mean, belated in development, the economic stuff was being held back, okay, by those belated political developments. Even though they had a industrious culture, they had enough, I would say, Protestantism, they had enough of similar cultural to the English that they should have taken off like England, but they couldn't because of the inability for the ruling establishment to create cohesion around a single economic plan. So what happened is that economists and people from different proto-nationalist and socialist and proto-fascist parties in Germany went to the young Soviet Union and were members of something called ARPLAN, which was like the Association on the Research of Association on the Research of the Planned Economy. Okay, so Zinoviev, who was head of the Third International under Lenin, invited people from these different people's parties and radical populist movements and economists and professors who were, this is not Marxist, some were, but just across the traditions, anarchists, proto-fascist, nationalists, the whole thing. And they studied how the Soviet economy was able to do it. So fascism did learn from the Bolshevik experience that you need to concentrate political power and overcome these contradictions between the ruling families so that the country can have a single dynamic plan to develop, 5-year plan, 7-year plan, 10-year plan, right, okay. So there is these connections between that, but it wasn't that the Soviet Union was fascist, but that fascism learned part of its economic theory, one which it was never quite able to implement because they never fascism never accomplished a revolution against the ruling class. They tried to create a party state. It's more like the Chinese Revolution. They tried to create a party state and then have the different children of the ruling class pretend to be workers and then become party members of the fascist movement to create a type of social state. This happened in China. In the Communist Party of China, had many wealthy families join the Communist Party, and then they rewrote the history that these people were overthrown and not involved when they were the ones at the foundational level of it. So now that did happen in the Soviet Union too, but to a lesser extent. What happened in the Soviet Union is all of the contradictions. I mean, it was bloody. You have gulags and stuff like that. But you have to like knock over a few. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So to create this dynamic society, that Soviet Union, Russia went from being one of the most backwards and impoverished great powers of Europe to being the most economically dynamic in the period of just 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
So and this wasn't because of socialism in the way that you would rigorously define socialism. This was because they concentrated political power and overcame all of those things that were holding back semi-feudal countries like Germany at the close of the 19th century, or Italy at the close of the 19th century.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So you had to, there's a guy named James Burnham who was a Trotskyite who was very close to, ideologically, to George Orwell, Eric Blair, who was also a Trotskyite. But they were a type of Trotskyites that became disillusioned with Trotsky and became disillusioned with the prospects for a Soviet society that it could like democratize or whatever. I mean, they were actually very dynamic thinkers. James Burnham actually does not think that the Soviet Union was socialist. But he analyzes fascism and Bolshevism as being part of the same thing that happened in the United States under Roosevelt and in the years before, which he calls the managerial revolution. So in other words, it's kind of like technocracy, where instead of these different familial and vested landed interests and competing interests that were holding back society, that you would need that whenever you like did analysis of a business, Yuri, there was of course the owner, but many times he was absentee or he was just the owner who collected the money, but the managers actually understood how the whole firm was running, and we should pay the workers more here, but we should cut out these excesses over there. This is a waste of money, but we should invest over here. The owners didn't understand. The owners were not always hands-on. Okay, so the managers really understood. The managers had the relationships with the workers, but they also had the relationships with the owners. They were, and so people say that this was also fascism. Okay, the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was maybe a managerial revolution in the ideas of James Burnham, and to a lesser extent Max Shachtman. But but what people mean by red fascism is to relativize the important differences that in Germany, the ruling class that had created the problems, that had pushed Germany into numerous disastrous military confrontations, had never had to step down. They never, like, people died in wars, people were impoverished, people were living in the streets. Like, people in Germany were living like third world conditions until the 1930s. So the problem, which is why people love the Nazis so much, because they lifted like a lot of the productive forces and eradicated a lot of poverty. They created a sense and reality of middle class dignity for the very bottom of the working class. So, but the issue for the errors, I mean, not even errors, I mean, they're not errors, they're built in as part of the program. It's an erroneous program. Fascism is an erroneous program. It never challenged, it tried to make a coordination between these different vested interests that had previously made impossible coordination, and tried to bring them together without a real rotation of elites, without a real change of power. So you still had IG Farber, Mercedes-Benz, Oppenheimer, all the, technochemical industries, industrial firms still were heavily in power. They just put on the uniform, they put on the red armband, they all agreed that, Hitler's going to be the Fuhrer, and he didn't have absolute power at all. They still controlled, Hitler was a puppet of these firms, and Hitler wrote about this all the time. I mean, it's the evidence. This is not a theory. It's not what communists think, right? He wrote about this all the time. He was complaining, I should have done what Stalin did, and I should have purged the kulaks. I should have eliminated the all of these incompetent captains and lower generals who are going to destroy the war effort. I should have done what Stalin did and just decapitated the old elite.
Yeah, well, and many people who criticize Russia, including in the Russian patriotic, some people in the Russian patriotic circle say, oh, why did Stalin repress the elite of the military? If Stalin didn't do that, the Germans could have never made it to Moscow, blah, blah, blah. But
they would have opened the doors to Moscow. Like those see, the military academies, Russia, the Soviet Union had to build its own military academies. But everyone until the 30s had gone to military school in Prussia. So that's how the Bolshevik Revolution actually was able to happen, because you had the Decembrist conspiracy among the the Bavarian Freemasons, and they were heavily involved in the Prussian Military Academy, and they were Republicans. They were anti-Tsarists, and they were the ones who fought, and they got the first Duma established. And when the power of the Duma was stripped, they began to organize a second series of revolts. Many of them then came over to the Bolsheviks. They went over to the Whites too. They went over to the Whites, not the monarchist whites. We're talking about the social democrat whites, the first whites, not the Civil War whites, but the revolutionary whites.
Yeah.
So there was a conspiracy of the officer corps to overthrow the Romanovs, and it was because of the Germans. Lenin was part of a German plot to overthrow the Romanovs. Okay, so Stalin knew about that. You know, Stalin saved the revolution from the consequences of the Trotsky-Stalin difference, which that Trotsky was supported by New York and the United States, and Lenin was supported by Germany, and that's why Trotsky pursues the war against Germany and loses, and that's why Lenin was calling for the end of the war with Germany.
Yeah.
So these are opposite people that had opposite revolutionary ends geopolitically. They wound up in the same movement because the U.S. had Trotsky insert himself into the Bolshevik Party as an agent of capital. However, Stalin was an ascetic. He was like in the image of Marcus Aurelius. He was a stoic, and he was like an Orthodox monk.
Yeah.
And he was neither part of the German plot, nor was he a part of the American plot. But he could see that the same mechanisms of the officer corps, of the Soviet Union were the same people that had overthrown Romanov as part of a German plot. So why wouldn't he get rid of those people? Yeah, they had been part of the revolution, and many of them then went over to the Red Army, but people are not ideological. You have to understand, people like have homes, they have like expenses, they have families, they have wives, they have children, they have careers, you know? So like when the Bolsheviks took over, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, we're all reading the Communist Manifesto now, like, okay, like that's our job. You know, well, we're communists now, the Red Army, but that's not how things work. So of course he had to do that. And Hitler constantly complained about the generals conspiring against him.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Stalin didn't have these kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.